The first part of the forward superstructure that I'm going to construct is the conning tower. That might sound a bit strange considering that I haven't constructed the lower levels. It's kind of in the middle of the superstructure. The reason for me starting with the conning tower is that although it has a lot of corrections that need to be made to it, it is a simple component once constructed. That means that it'll be easy to handle. There's not a lot that I'm going to be able to damage once it is fully built. But because of the number of corrections that need to be made to it, it does need to be handled a lot during its construction. As pointed out by the HMS Hood Association, the main problem with the conning tower as provided by Trumpeter is that the viewing slits are not all of the same height. This is particularly problematic for the viewing slits that are created by combining parts A30 and A19. The viewing slits created by these components are roughly twice the height of any other viewing slits created by the other components in the conning tower. During construction, I'm going to have to reduce the height of that slit to make it the same height as all of the others. The second problem with the conning tower is that when you combine components to create a slit, you create a joint line that needs to be filled in and smoothed out. The conning tower shouldn't have any visible lines directly under the viewing slits. This is the only visible line that should be on the conning tower. Due to the need to reduce the height of these viewing slits and the large number of lines that will need to be filled in and smoothed out, obviously this area of the ship is going to be handled extensively, and that is why I want to start with it, to have as minimal components on this area of the ship as possible so that it's just easy for me to handle it and not damage any other components that might have been stuck down. This is also why I wanted to construct this part off of the ship, which is a very clear departure from what is said in the manual. Always remember that manuals don't give you the optimal way to build a ship. They just show you the steps that you need to eventually go through. In this case, if you had built the conning tower as indicated in the instruction manual, you would have a lot more difficulty in correcting these seam lines. Now that you know what needs to be done to construct the conning tower, we can begin. In the previous video where I planned the construction of the forward superstructure, I cut all the components that are needed for this phase of the build off of their sprues so that I could do a test fit with them on the ship. Due to that, I obviously don't need to cut them off the sprue and I can move straight into the cleanup process. Most of these components are very simple. The only one that is a little bit complicated is A19. That is this larger component with a section of deck. Once again, these components follow the same theme as with pretty much every component in the ship, and there is a little bit of flashing. Fortunately, these components don't have a lot of detail on them and they're not very complicated, which means that it is easy to remove this flashing. The flashing is particularly bad on the injection points on the undersides of these components. Normally that isn't such an issue because that would be facing in towards a cavity. But since many of these components sit flat directly on top of each other, that flashing needs to be removed, otherwise they won't be able to make proper contact. To clean up the flashing and to remove the connection sites to the sprue and the injection sites, I use a file. Once all the components have been sufficiently filed, they can be glued together. At this point, I'm not going to be doing any finishing with sanding because there's going to have to be a lot more of that at a later stage when I do all the corrections. On part A30, Trumpeter saw it fit to put a connection point to the sprue in the middle of a viewing slit. This is unfortunate and I think also unnecessary because there's plenty of places where they could put a connection point to the sprue on this part. It's not exactly complicated, but in the location that they have put it, it makes it considerably more difficult to remove the excess plastic. Why they do this, and they do this quite a lot, I find, in Trumpeter kits, I do not know. I wish they would just avoid detail when they do put down these connection points and injection points. This kind of thing frustrates me. It's just unfortunate that they decide to put a connection point on a part with such little detail on it in one of the few places where it has detail. Why? Anyways, with a little bit of effort, I do manage to dig out that plastic and file it relatively smooth. Fortunately, of all these components, that's the only one with a dubious choice for where to attach it to the sprue. All the other ones are well formed and easy enough to clean up, despite a little bit of flashing on all of them. Now the parts sit on top of each other nicely, they can be glued together. For the first round of gluing, I'm using Revell Contactor Professional. I apply a small drop of this to the surface using a toothpick and then place the second part on top of the first part. This will tack the part in place and hold everything together while I go about the assembly. Ultimately, I am going to want to blend in the seam lines, which means I do need to fill all the way to the very edge of the part. The easiest way to do that is to bond it together using extra thin plastic cement. So after the initial round of tacking all the components together with Revell Contactor Professional and being happy with their position, I then reinforce the bonds with Tamiya extra thin plastic cement that I apply to the seam lines. While this will help create a very good bond between these components, this will not be sufficient. I'm going to have to take further steps to fill in these seam lines. Extra thin glue is only going to go so far. But before I go about correcting the seam lines, I need to address the heights of these slits. Most of the slits are around 0.5 millimeter tall, and visually it's not too easy to distinguish between that variance between the 0.5 millimeter tall slits. The extra tall one is 1 millimeter tall, which is very obviously different from all of the others, so I need to fill that. I'm using 0.5 millimeter styrene stock. Unfortunately, I don't have strips of square 0.5 millimeter styrene stock. I have strips of 0.5 millimeter by 1/4 millimeter, which means I need to use multiple pieces to build up sufficient plastic to actually fill this gap. These slits are also fairly deep, more than 0.5 millimeter deep. In the end, I found the best way to fill the gap is to take a appropriately cut piece of styrene stock, place 2 in stacked on top of each other, and then put a third one on front of it, as if it's a cover. And then in the cases where there is more substantial curve on the exterior of the conning tower, to place a 4th piece, and then have sufficient excess styrene sticking out of the side such that I'll be able to sand it off in the future. All of these styrene strips are glued in place using Tamiya extra thin plastic cement. In a few cases, I don't get the styrene stock to perfectly curve and match the interior wall of the slit, but this is going to be filled with black and it's going to be difficult to see in there anyway. So if there are small gaps in the corners at the back of this part, it's going to be difficult to see them. Probably impossible to see them. So I'm not concerned about that. While reducing the heights of the viewing slits, I also worked on removing the seam lines. I'm using gap filling medium, so it's just a thick super glue, to remove those seam lines. I find this works quite well because it dries hard and also dries quite quickly, and then it's very easy to sand. It's also thin enough such that you can paint it on and have it flow into gaps quite easily. I apply the gap filling medium to all of the seam lines that I want to remove and also apply it around the styrene stock that I have already installed. Gap filling medium works really well on the edges of the viewing slits. It seems to be the right consistency to sit in place and not pour into the viewing slit. And I know that once it's hard, it's going to be very easy to sand off, especially considering the very smooth shape of the conning tower and this nice gentle curve. With the styrene stock sticking out the edges of the viewing slits and the gap filling super glue all caked on the seam lines, the part looks very rough. Hopefully I've done all of this correctly and I'm able to recover it back to a condition that was better than when I started. While there isn't a lot of detail in this component, and I don't think it's going to be very difficult to sand, I do need to be careful of the concentric rings. And in a case like this, a file with one edge that is smooth is very helpful, because it allows you to have some safety when you are sanding in a corner and you only want to take off plastic on one surface. To remove the excess plastic and glue, I'm using the bar file from the Tamiya Basic file set. It is one of those files that has one side smooth. Starting at the top, this first circular level of the conning tower is quite easy to clean up. There's nothing to obstruct the file at this level, so it's really just a matter of removing the excess and not damaging the component below it. Moving down one level, I need to blend the front of this kidney-shaped portion of the conning tower with the circular section below it. There is a bit of a step in this area that needs to be sorted out. I had filled the area with gap filler, but it seems to need a bit more attention. Once again, there isn't a lot of detail in this area, so it's really just a case of slowly working it down. The only thing to be careful of is to not take off too much plastic and turn the circle into an oval. But that's unlikely to happen. It's like a 0.1 millimeter step that needs to be removed. It's very small. All I need to do is sand until the line disappears. Going down one more level, and this is where there's the majority of the sanding that needs to be done, because here I need to remove the excess glue and styrene stock that I used to fill, or to at least reduce the height of the viewing slits. Fortunately, this is the easiest area of the conning tower to sand, because there are no details that I need to worry about banging into. Once again, I just need to carefully work my way around the conning tower, being careful not to take off too much or to alter the shape of the conning tower. The lowest level of the conning tower, or at least this section of the conning tower, goes much the same way as for the previous section. There's a little bit more plastic in the way that I just need to be a bit careful of, but it's really not that complicated to clean up. After removing the excess with a file and then sanded with a 240 grit sandpaper to remove the worst of the scratches, I then moved to 400 grit sandpaper to get a smoother finish that is ready for Mr. Surfacer 500. In a situation like this where seam lines have been corrected and I have filled gaps with styrene, Mr. Surfacer is going to be especially useful. Normal paint, once dry, is very thin and will not fill these scratches. By using Mr. Surfacer, it will fill the micro defects on these parts and little scratches. And for the larger ones that it is unable to cope with, it will make them visible so I can manually correct them myself. After spraying the conning tower with Mr. Surfacer, I check it for defects. The only real defect is a little bit of extra glue at the top section on this small circular component of the conning tower. Other than that, it's in very good shape and I'm very happy with the outcome. I'm also very happy that I didn't try to do this while I was all stuck to the ship, because I know that this would have been nearly impossible to achieve, at least to this level of quality. And as you can see, now that this component is constructed, it isn't actually very complicated. I can handle this very freely and not worry about damaging it. And that's ideal, because I've now gotten through a lot of complicated work that will be difficult to do with other components around it, but the result is a component that is very easy to handle and can be worked with in close proximity to the other components that need to be installed. In the next video, I'll work on the structure that goes directly below this part of the conning tower. That will be in building the base and doing the initial prep work for that area of the superstructure. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.